Hello and welcome to our introductory series on the divine principle. I'm Reverend Philip Schenker. In our first presentation, we studied the principle of creation, the laws and principles that govern the natural world. And from there, we came to understand the nature, purpose, and heart of the first cause, the Creator whom we call God. We came to understand the purpose of human life and the value of human beings on the earth, the relationship between our spiritual and physical selves, and the integral role that human responsibility plays in the accomplishment of God's will for human beings. Next, we studied the human fall and came to realize that our first ancestors' disobedience to God's commandment and failure to fulfill the purpose of creation was much more than simple individual disobedience. The fall undermined the foundation for God's ideal for the family. False love was established, centered on a false master. And from this original sin, the tradition of self-centeredness and false love was passed down to all subsequent generations, and an evil history came about. Then we studied the principle of restoration, how an almighty and loving God has worked to save and restore his children back to the place where we could accomplish the original purpose of creation. And the promise of a Messiah who comes as the Son of God, truly divine, and yet also Son of Man, representing what is truly human, an original Adam, regenerated from a dead lineage. We considered the principles of restoration, how God will call a central figure to accomplish a responsibility, and if that central figure falls short, the will remains, and God will call another central figure in a later age to accomplish the same responsibility. Hence, we could see that while God's will is predestined absolutely to be accomplished, I have spoken and I will bring it to pass, its accomplishment is conditional based upon human beings fulfilling our portion of responsibility. From these perspectives, in our next presentations, we reevaluated some of the aspects of our traditional faith. We gained new insight into the purpose of the Messiah, the mission of Jesus, the meaning of the last days, the resurrection of the dead. We looked once again at the meaning of rebirth and the mystery of the Trinity, and hence answered many questions that have puzzled believers in past centuries. Then we began to look at the central figures in the history of the providence of restoration. We looked at the missions of Adam, Noah, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Moses, and Jesus, and from the biblical record extracted principles and patterns by which God has governed the process of restoration. Today, we're going to begin, for the rest of our series, a process that may seem tedious, but I think you'll find it meaningful and exciting. We're going to apply these principles of restoration found in the biblical record to history outside of the Bible, all of human history from the beginning until now, including the time we're living in. So let's begin today by understanding the periods in providential history and the determination of their lengths. First, let's consider the meaning of parallel providential periods. When a period of history repeats the events of a previous period, even though there may be differences in the scope or the degree, the periods are called parallel providential periods. The principal cause behind these parallels lies in God's providence of restoration and the principle of indemnity, meaning the conditions necessarily made by human beings to restore what was lost previously. Now, let's consider the factors that determine these parallel providential periods. Parallel periods recur because of repeated dispensations to restore what we've been studying, the foundation to receive the Messiah. Accordingly, the factors which determine the formation of parallel providential periods are, first, the three conditions necessary for the foundation of faith: the central person, the person who represents Adam, who lost faith in God's word, and who, by obeying God's direction or word, restores that faith. Second, the offering or conditional object, which, by being offered, represents the original commandment that was to be obeyed. And thirdly, the time period, representing the growth period that Adam should have completed. Secondly, these parallel periods are determined by these contents: the indemnity condition to remove the fallen nature, which is necessary to restore the foundation of substance. So there's someone in the position of Abel, and a person or group or nation in the position of Cain that must unite with that chosen central person. These factors shape the parallels of history. So there are two characteristics of parallel providential periods that stand out. First, the lengths of these periods are determined based on a fixed number of generations or years of the necessary indemnity period, representing, of course, the growth period for Adam and Eve originally. Second, the parallels in history are shaped by these providential factors: the central figure, the offering or conditional object for the foundation of faith, and the indemnity condition to remove the fallen nature for the foundation of substance, consisting of an Abel position and a Cain position or people that should unite with that Abel. Now, let's consider the ages in the providence of restoration and how these parallels were determined. The first period of history, the period from Adam to Abraham, is known as the age of the foundation for restoration. Let's consider how these periods developed in that age. The numbers of generations or years in the periods of the age to lay the foundation for restoration. So, why and how is the providence of restoration prolonged? First, why is it prolonged? According to the principle of predestination, since God absolutely predestines his will, he will surely realize it one day. I have spoken, and I will bring it to pass. I have purposed, and I will do it. Isaiah 46:11. I tell you, till heaven and earth pass away, not a dot, not an iota will escape from the law until everything is accomplished. Jesus in Matthew 5:18. However, whether God's will is fulfilled through any particular individual is conditional upon the fulfillment of that individual's portion of responsibility. In Deuteronomy 28 and 30, God makes clear, I have set before you life and death, blessing or curse, and you must choose. Therefore, choose life. So it's contingent upon the fulfillment of human beings' portion of responsibility. Accordingly, when the will is not fulfilled because the responsible person fails, God will rebuild the foundation and choose another person in a later era to take his place. Now, God's will is determined absolutely. Therefore, he will continue his work until its complete fulfillment, which prolongs the providence in the process. Next, how is it prolonged? Or in what manner are these ages shaped and developed? According to the principle of creation, God is a being of the number 3. In other words, God's nature contains the dual characteristics of inner nature, his character, which is one aspect, and his external expression or form, which is a second aspect. And then the united whole formed from their oneness is the third aspect. Likewise, when God creates every living being, he expresses himself through origin, division, union, action, as we studied in the principle of creation. Hence, all things created in his likeness manifest themselves through a 3-stage process with respect to their mode of existence, their movement, and their growth. We can see that the entire creation develops through 3 distinct stages of growth. Therefore, whenever the providence of restoration is prolonged or delayed, it may extend to as many as 3 stages. Restoration, likewise, involves 3 stages of growth. Now let's tackle a complicated concept: vertical indemnity conditions and horizontal restoration. Now in this discussion, vertical refers to the conditions inherited from earlier ages, passed down vertically, or those which we pass on. And horizontal refers to those conditions made in our lifetime on the earth. So the conditions we inherit, what we're meant to accomplish on earth, and then vertically what we pass down. Let's discuss. A central figure who is responsible for the providence of restoration must fulfill in a short time, in his own lifetime, all the indemnity conditions which his predecessors tried to fulfill. For example, when Cain and Abel could not unite, that unfulfilled condition became the responsibility of the second providential family, Noah's family. So Ham and Shem had that inherited condition plus their own responsibility to unite. When they failed to unite, the accumulated responsibility was inherited by the third providential family, the family of Abraham. Now, Jacob and Esau had the responsibility to restore through indemnity the unfulfilled conditions plus their own responsibility to unite. Now, you can see that the more the providence of restoration is prolonged and the past indemnity conditions accumulate, then the heavier will be the conditions of indemnity which the new central figure must fulfill. The conditions which accumulate in the course of providential history are called vertical indemnity conditions. And this process, the task of the central figure to fulfill all of these conditions in a short time, is called horizontal restoration through indemnity. Now, the opposite situation can also occur, where horizontal restoration can be continued vertically. For example, when a central figure doesn't fulfill their responsibility in the third stage, it can then be passed on through successive generations. For example, by making an acceptable symbolic offering, Abraham was originally supposed to restore horizontally all the vertical conditions which had accumulated due to the mistakes of Adam's and Noah's families. Yet, Abraham's mistake in his first offering caused another failure. Since this was the third attempt in the providence to restore the family foundation for the Messiah, the principle required his family accomplish without fail. To this end, God set up a special dispensation. God had Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob fulfill the necessary indemnity conditions while regarding these 3 as one person with respect to his will. Therefore, despite this prolongation through 3 generations, God could credit Abraham with having fulfilled the horizontal indemnity conditions. This is the reason why, when the Jews refer to the God of Israel, when the God of Israel is mentioned in Scripture, he's the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob, because these 3 individuals accomplished one providential mission. Now let's consider the numerical indemnity periods that shape these periods for restoring the foundation of faith. A central figure has to fulfill one or more numerical indemnity periods in order to restore the foundation of faith. Why is this? It's based on the principle of creation. The first human ancestors were to become complete by passing through a growing period characterized by certain numbers, thus laying the foundation of faith. Now, what would these numbers be? In the process of development, one of them would be the number 3, coming from the 3 stages of growth. Another would be the accomplishment of the 4-position foundation. Another number would be represented by the 7 stages of development, or as the Bible calls, the 7 days of creation in maturing the universe, the number 7. Also, we remember the 3 objects' purpose, how each of the participants in the 4-position foundation are to make oneness with the other 3. So the number 12 has its foundation in the completion of the purpose of creation. The number 21 comes from 3 stages of this completion of the number 7. and so on, and so on. So we find these providential numbers repeated throughout the Bible, even manifested in our physical bodies and in the laws of nature. Let's consider how they govern the providence. If Adam and Eve had accomplished the purpose of creation, they would have become the perfect embodiments of the quality of the numbers 12, 4, 21, and 40. Due to their fall, however, even as they were claimed by Satan, so also these numbers were claimed. Therefore, the central figures in the providential history must fulfill these numerical periods of indemnity to restore the numbers 12, 4, 21, and 40 in order to restore the foundation of faith. Now let's consider how in the family of Abraham, at the end of this first 2,000-year period, Abraham's failure caused horizontal restoration to be extended through the next 2 generations vertically, and how that extension reflected these providential numbers. Abraham had the opportunity to restore the numerical indemnity periods all at once through the symbolic offering. However, because he failed in his offering, the indemnity periods could not be restored horizontally or in that moment in his lifetime. It became necessary for them to be restored vertically, in other words, through the successive generations, including Isaac and Jacob. By prolonging the fulfillment of his will through Isaac and Jacob, God worked then to fulfill in succession indemnity periods that would restore the numbers 12, 4, 21, and 40. Let's see how that took place. First, the 120 years of the 3 generations of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Now this is measured biblically from the time that Abraham first left Haran on his journey to Canaan, began his mission and his course, until the time when Jacob purchased the birthright from Esau. These 120 years represented these 3 generations. Then followed a 40-year period when Jacob and Esau struggled, from the time that Jacob purchased the birthright until he won the blessing from his aging father. This 40 years, the brothers were divided and struggling over the birthright and blessing. Because of that disunity, Jacob had to flee in Haran. This was a 21-year period in Haran. When Jacob returned, united with his brother, and made the foundation and became Israel, there then followed a 40-year period from the time of this united family until Jacob's family moved into Egypt and united, centered on Joseph, who had become the prime minister in Egypt. Thus they were now in the position in Egypt to begin the 400 years of slavery that began the next providential period. A careful examination of the scripture will show the lengths of these ages as recorded there. So now, this extension, this prolongation in Abraham's family took place at the end of this initial 2,000-year period. And this age from Adam to Jacob is called the age of the providence to lay the foundation for restoration. And upon that foundation, later ages were shaped. So this age to lay the foundation for restoration became the basis for the providence of history, and we'll see that later ages came to reflect it. Now let's consider the second age in the providence of restoration. That time from Abraham's family extended up until Jacob and Joseph, from Abraham to Jesus. This is the Old Testament period in biblical history. It's also the age of restoration. So let's consider the periods and their lengths in the age of the providence of restoration. So we have this foundational period upon which it is based. Based on that age of the providence for the foundation for restoration, God raised the age of the providence of restoration, because it was to restore through indemnity the earlier age. Let's consider then the relationship between these 2 ages. The first 400-year period of the Old Testament era, or the age of restoration, was a period of slavery in Egypt. And as you remember, it was necessary due to the failure of Abraham in his first offering. Abraham stood upon the foundation of a 400-year period of preparation. His mistake in his symbolic offering defiled this foundation. To recover this foundation of 400 years, God had the Israelites undergo slavery in Egypt. Now, this period of slavery in Egypt was parallel to the period from Adam to Noah, restoring that earlier period through parallel indemnity conditions. Now, the second period of Jewish history, the Old Testament history, the era of restoration, the second 2,000 years, was a 400-year period of the Judges. This period was from the time that the Israelites entered into Canaan. The 12 tribes divided the land and lived under the rulership of judges until the establishment of a kingdom in Israel through the enthronement of King Saul. Now you'll see that this period of Judges was parallel to the 400 years from Noah to Abraham, restoring that earlier period through parallel indemnity conditions. Now you'll notice that just as the flood separated Noah's family from their past history of suffering and slavery and evil and allowed them to make a new beginning in a new world, so also the Red Sea, Exodus, separated the Israelites from their past slavery and suffering and allowed them to make a new beginning in the land of Canaan. The third period in the history of the Jewish nation, this history of restoration, the Old Testament history, was a 120-year period of the United Kingdom. It began from King Saul. During the 40 years of his reign, Saul was to lay the foundation of faith by what? By respecting the Abrahamic covenant, the Mosaic law, by building the temple, by uniting the people around one tradition of faith in preparation for the Messiah. This would have been accomplished through the building of the temple. However, when Saul became faithless, God's will to build the temple was prolonged through the 2 40-year reigns of David and Solomon. Thus, the period of the United Kingdom was prolonged to 120 years. Now, this is obviously parallel to the 3 generations of Abraham's family in the earlier period, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Just as the dispensation, which began with Abraham, was prolonged through Isaac and Jacob, God's dispensation with King Saul was extended to King David and King Solomon. The next period in the Old Testament or restorational era was a period of 400 years of divided kingdoms. This period where the Israelite kingdom was divided into 2 reflects the 40-year period in Abraham's family's course where the brothers were divided in 2. Now this period began when the United Kingdom in Israel was divided after Solomon into the northern kingdom of Israel, where there were 10 tribes and more unrighteous kings, and the southern kingdom of Judah, where there were 2 tribes and more righteous kings. This period lasted until the people of Judah were taken into exile in Babylon. In fact, the northern kingdom of Israel, the 10 tribes, were decimated by the Assyrians, as we'll discuss later. We're going to talk about the details of all of these periods a little bit later. The northern kingdom decimated by the Assyrians. History refers to them as the 10 lost tribes of Israel. But the remnant, the 2 tribes in Judah, also fell into faithlessness, and they were taken into captivity in Babylon at the end of this period. This period is parallel to the 40 years from when Jacob purchased the birthright from Esau until he received the blessing of Isaac and God before leaving for Haran. 40 years of divided brothers, 400 years of divided kingdoms. The next period of Old Testament history, this foundational period of restoration, was the 210-year period of Israel's exile and return. The people of Judah sinned against God. As a result, they were taken into exile in Babylon for 70 years. The Persians then defeated the Babylonians, and King Cyrus liberated the Jews, and they began a gradual return to Jerusalem. Once they returned, under Ezra and Nehemiah, they rebuilt their temples and walls. Malachi prophesied the coming of Elijah and to be followed by the Messiah, and they began preparations to receive their promised king. Now, this period was parallel to the 21-year period when Jacob left Canaan until his return, restoring that earlier period through parallel indemnity conditions. Now, it's interesting to note that Jacob's exile was also initially 7 years, like the 70 years of the Jewish exile in Babylon. 7 years in Haran, he was promised by his uncle Laban to be given his daughter Rachel in marriage. But Laban tricked Jacob, gave him his older daughter. So Jacob had to labor another 7 years for the hand of Rachel and another 7 years for wealth and prosperity. A 7-year course that became 21 years, like the later 210-year exile of the Jews. The final period of Old Testament history was the 400-year period of preparation for the coming of the Messiah. This from Malachi until Jesus. After the Jewish people returned from exile, until the birth of Jesus, they reestablished their faith. And based on Malachi's prophecy that Elijah would come, followed by the Messiah, they began as a nation to prepare for his coming. They restored the law as the center of Jewish tradition. They restored worship in the temple, the school of the Pharisees, and a strong tradition waiting for the day when the Lord would come. Now, this period was parallel to the 40-year period from Jacob's return to Canaan until Jacob's family reunited in Egypt, centering on Joseph. And it restored that earlier period through parallel indemnity conditions. So we can see that this pre-Old Testament era, which formed the foundation for the providence of restoration. Please remember, during that period, because human beings had fallen so low, deceitful above all things, there was no foundation to receive God's word. And so no commandments or laws, but human beings related to God through offerings, the best of our flock, the best of our crop. However, this period was paralleled by the later Old Testament age, centered on the Ten Commandments and the Jewish laws. We can see the clear process of restoration through indemnity. Next, let us consider the next age in the providence of restoration. Now, up until now, we've been discussing the parallels and patterns and ages as described in the Bible. But if Christian history inherited this same mission, shouldn't it also then parallel the history of the Old Testament? Would it be possible that this history outside of the Bible follows the same pattern, the same ages, the same process as biblical history? If so, we would have to recognize the hand of a loving and wise God working behind the events of history. Let's take a look. Let's consider the periods and their lengths in the age of the prolongation of the providence of restoration. We remember that this pre-Old Testament age made the foundation. The Old Testament age, the age of restoration, paralleled it. Now, as a result of the crucifixion, another age was necessary. Jesus came, we now understand, as the Messiah to be received by the prepared people of Israel, to establish a kingdom with justice and with righteousness, to sit on the throne of David, to rule over his kingdom, and that the people of all nations would come and learn God's way, that the kingdom of God would be established at that time. However, because of the crucifixion, Jesus met with faithlessness. He was rejected, misunderstood, never acknowledged as the very Messiah that the people were waiting for, sent to the cross. Therefore, the providence of Christianity came about as a restoration of this earlier period. The age of the prolongation of the providence of restoration is a substantial parallel to the age of restoration. Therefore, the corresponding periods will proceed in a parallel fashion, both in order and in length. If so, it will give us deeper insight into the significance of the providence of restoration. Now, in later presentations, we're going to discuss the details of each of these ages and how they paralleled. But now let's just look at the formation and length of the ages and the basic symmetry between them. We know the age of restoration, the Old Testament era, 400 years of slavery in Egypt, 400 years of the tribes being ruled by judges, 100 years of a united kingdom, the 400 years of divided kingdoms, the 210 years of exile and return, and finally a 400-year period of preparation to receive the Messiah. Let's now look at the development of the later ages and how it followed the same course. The first period of Christian history outside of the Bible, but able to be viewed in recorded history, was a 400-year period of Roman persecution. During this period, the Roman Empire persecuted Christians. Ultimately, Emperor Constantine began the change when he formally recognized Christianity's right to exist as a legal religion in 313. But ultimately, it was 392 when the Emperor Theodosius established Christianity as the state religion of the Roman Empire. This period was parallel to the Israelites' 400-year period of slavery in Egypt. Its purpose was to restore that earlier period through parallel indemnity conditions. Now, the next period of Christian history, of New Testament history, was the 400-year period of regional church leadership. In this period, the people were led by regional church leaders, patriarchs, bishops, and abbots, with multiple roles corresponding to the judges in the earlier period in Israel. The purpose of this period was to restore that earlier period of judges through parallel indemnity conditions. In the Old Testament era, just as the 12 tribes had moved in and divided Israel into lands under each of the tribes, so also in the New Testament era, the Christian realm was divided into 5 holy sees. And like the time of the tribes, when the strongest of the tribal leaders was made the judge, so also the strongest of the patriarchs of these 5 sees became the Pope. There are other parallels which we'll discuss in detail in our next presentation. The next period of Christian history was the 120-year period of Christian empire. His name was Charles the Great, or Charlemagne. His goal was to build St. Augustine's city of God and to realize a godly Christian empire which he envisioned as the Holy Roman Empire. Now, this 120-year period of Christian empire, also called the Carolingian Empire, began with Charlemagne's enthronement as emperor on Christmas Day in 800 AD. This united empire ended 119 years later, when Charlemagne's royal line ceased. His grandsons conflicted and divided the empire. It ended in the eastern half of the realm, and Henry I was elected king of the German lands. The purpose of this period was to restore the earlier 120-year United Kingdom of Israel through parallel indemnity conditions. The next period in Christian history, we'll learn, was the 400-year period of divided kingdoms. The Carolingian Empire was divided into 2 kingdoms: the Eastern Franks, which became the Holy Roman Empire, and the Western Franks, which became the Kingdom of France. This period was the parallel to the 400-year period when the Israelite kingdom was divided between Judah in the south and the 2 tribes there, and Israel in the north and the 10 tribes there, restoring that earlier period through parallel indemnity conditions. The next period of Christian history was, amazingly, a 210-year period of papal exile and return. The 210-year period of exile and return of the Pope restored through parallel indemnity conditions the earlier period of Judah's exile and return. It began in 1309 AD, when Pope Clement V was literally kidnapped, forced to move the papacy from Rome to Avignon in France, and to live there subject to the kings of France. How long was the papacy in France? 68 years until 1377, when Gregory XI returned the papacy to Rome. However, after the papacy returned to Rome, the confusion and conflict did not end. The next pope was rejected by a group within the church, and another pope was elected. These two were arguing until a third arose and said the other two are not legitimate. This papal schism caused great confusion, and this period of political fighting and struggle continued until the Protestant Reformation in 1517. The final period of Christian history, beginning from Martin Luther, is a 400-year period of preparation for the second advent of the Messiah. A parallel 400-year period of preparation for the Messiah began in 1517 with Martin Luther and the Protestant Reformation. This period lasted until the eve of the second advent of Christ on the earth. The purpose of this period was to restore the earlier period of preparation for the first advent. We can see the distinct parallels between these two periods. This final 400 years brought us onto the doorstep of the 20th century, the beginning of the first of several world wars, which Jesus said in Matthew 24 would be the signs of his coming. Wars and rumors of wars, nation rising against nation, kingdom against kingdom. This 400-year period brought us to the establishment of communism, the first of a number of tyrannical movements, including Nazism and other fascist efforts in the 20th century, anti-God, ultimately anti-Christian, and therefore ultimately anti-Christ. The 20th century and this era of tremendous struggle was the struggle to end the old history and begin a new history. So we see that the 2,000 years of the history of Israel, the Old Testament age, recorded in the Bible, was paralleled by the 2,000 years of Christian history recorded outside the Bible. It is therefore possible for us to recognize that a loving and wise God has been working through the process of human history, not by arbitrarily making people do this or that or controlling events, but through the principle of restoration that governs the process of our struggle to return. In our next presentation, we're going to look at these two providential periods, the history of Israel and the history of Christianity, in greater detail, and we'll only see more clearly how these periods paralleled, and understand more deeply the process by which God is working to restore his children and fulfill his original purpose of creation. Thank you very much.